So I'm sure some of you have heard me talk about this before, but one of the most formative experiences in my life was the summer that I spent as a hospital chaplain intern about 10 years ago. I was assigned to a unit where people only stayed for a night or two, a really almost intensive care unit. So I rarely saw people more than one time before they were moved up or down. So most of my day consisted of knocking on doors, checking to see if people wanted to talk to the chaplain, basically making sort of pastoral cold calls all day long. I always think of the experience of being sent off into that work when I read this passage about Jesus sending the disciples off as sort of cold callers of the good news, to go out to new, strange villages, to stay in people's homes that they don't know. And I was having that experience, and I can still see the lines of doors, just this long line of doors that I sort of had to go knock on one by one. I remember being afraid very specifically of two things as I was beginning that work, as I was beginning that summer. So during our first week, I asked my supervisor, a longtime hospital chaplain, about those fears. I said, what if they don't want a visit from the chaplain and they're upset that me, a stranger, just an intern, is knocking on their door? My supervisor answered, people don't have a lot of control over what happens to them when they're in the hospital. Their lives and their bodies, their time, everything is kind of out of their control. So if the worst thing happens and somebody screams at you and throws their shoe at you and kicks you out, maybe that's the one thing that they had control over that day, was to kick you out of their room. So even then, you're giving them something valuable. And I said, okay, all right, so what about on the other side? So what if they really do want and need to talk to a chaplain, and I, inexperienced person that I am, imperfect person that I am, say the wrong thing, and they suffer more because of it in this painful, uncontrollable place? And he said, well, that'll probably happen at some point. But here you are. All you have is yourself. And that's the best and only thing that you can offer when you walk into a room like that. You just show up. And you don't pretend that you have all the answers anyway, because you don't. But showing up, listening, speaking with them, that makes a difference. And it can open up a space for God to work, because it's God's work anyway. So I listened to him, and I still do listen to him when I walk into difficult places. It was really good advice. I try to walk into difficult places with my hands open and my heart open, ready to encounter what is there. And although my supervisor didn't say this, I wonder if that advice was formed in part by reading and engaging with this story and with the pattern of discipleship that kind of emerged from this story. In this story, Jesus sends his disciples out into a difficult world to encounter people on their own turf, in their own homes and towns, to be with them, to open up a space for God to work. And I think 2,000 years later, God sends us too, as apostles, as disciples of the living God. Sends us to be with people, to be present with them, and also to be present with ourselves in difficult times. Show up, to listen, speak with them, to open up a place for God to work. As I was reading more about this passage and researching this week, I read a summary of what it means to be a companion to people in difficult times. It was written by the chaplain, Franklin D. Duncan, another longtime chaplain, sort of like my supervisor. And he also drew on this story as he summed up decades of work and learning. He said that to be a chaplain is to do four things, four very, I wouldn't say simple, but essential things. To show up in difficult circumstances, to do these four things. First, to show up, just to be there. Second, to listen. Third, to speak the truth. And fourth, to not take responsibility for the outcome, because it's God's work. And you kind of see that formula. It's not laid out in like a four-part plan from Jesus, but you kind of see that in this story. Jesus sends the disciples out to do just that. He sends them first to show up in people's lives, to go to people's towns and specifically to their homes, but to stay in one home until they leave that place. It's very specific about that. And there's a balance there that's not super obvious to us in the 21st century. So there was a tradition of itinerant preachers at that time who went from home to home very quickly. And so along with that, there was probably a sub-tradition of itinerant preachers who went from home to home very quickly and took advantage of the people that they met, sort of depending on their quick charm and a short stay to get away with some kind of grift. And Jesus doesn't want that. Jesus doesn't want the disciples to be in that tradition, to sort of be this showy show that stays for a second, does something flashy, and then moves on. Jesus doesn't want the disciples to be the music man and sell the 76 trombones or whatever. Like, Jesus wants the people to show up and be there. So he tells the disciples to stay for a time, to build a relationship, to get to know people. But on the other hand, Jesus asks the disciples to be dependent on the hospitality of others. They aren't to take money or possessions that would buy their way into the place. They're not to create a fixture or a pilgrimage spot for people to travel to them. The disciples, therefore, must be welcomed into a place in order to share God's love there. And they also must receive hospitality themselves. They're the recipients of something. They don't come in like sort of lordly people who have everything to share and need nothing. They have to receive as well. There's a give and take here. The disciples have something to offer. They have God's good news and healing that they're bringing. There's something real there that people need, that people respond to. But they also must listen. They also must show up as their full, needy selves and be present and receive from the people there. So right there in that interesting balance, we have sort of the first three steps embedded. The disciples show up, they listen, they receive, and they speak the truth. All of those things are necessary for this space for God to work, to unfold, to open up. And sometimes they're not received. Jesus doesn't tell them to stick it out or to stand outside yelling at them, to set up camp in the town square and make a big deal out of it. This is God's work. And God leaves people to choose whether to accept the truth and healing that the disciples come to bring or not. Maybe they aren't ready to hear it yet. Maybe the disciples have more to learn about how to show up and listen and speak the truth. Whatever the case is, the outcome remains God's. So where does this leave us today? I know my life right now, at least, includes plenty of time interacting with people who are having a difficult time. People who are recovering from a year of trauma, who are grieving things, and people that have been lost. I'm actually one of those people that I have to interact with, right? We all have to interact with ourselves every day. And I've had a difficult year, and sometimes it's hard to interact with me. I've had a difficult time. One of the hard things about this particular year of difficulty is that we've all been going through some really different circumstances all at the same time. So we have to be present both to ourselves in that and to others that we encounter. And so I think this story has a lot to say to us today. I think this story invites us to approach each other and to approach ourselves in the way that Jesus teaches us in this story. First, we show up. Show up as fully as we can for ourselves and for others, with our hearts and our hands open, knowing that we don't have anything to offer but ourselves and the love of God that is in us. And that is enough. We can show up to offer hospitality and show up to receive it too. I don't know what that looks like exactly for you. Maybe texting the person that you haven't connected with for a while, showing up at their door with flowers, sending a note. One of the gifts from the pandemic, I think, is that we've all learned a little bit about what it's like to show up, like to receive a thing in the mail, to see a person's face and how powerful that is. And we all know how to use Zoom too, so like we can connect with people who are far away. And when we show up for someone, we can listen. That's so much of what we can do for each other, actually, I think. We can listen, not try to jump to fixing, but just bear witness to where another person is, to what they've been through, to their holy journey that you get to be on for a little while with them. We can let that listening affect us and change us. And then we can speak the truth in love. Maybe the truth is a word of affirmation that we tend to ignore and forget in a culture that's always demanding more of us. The truth in love, I think, is often good news. We can say to people, God loves you. I love you. You're doing the best you can. Sometimes the truth is more difficult, too. But when we speak it in love, having truly listened, that truth can often bring healing, too, to ourselves, to others. We don't have to offer more than what we already know, right? We've all experienced love. We've all experienced healing. We can offer what we know about that as a gift, not as a overarching gift to come in and tell somebody what to do or to fix them, but just as an offering. If you've already shown up and been invited in and listened, then there's probably a space there where you can share that love, that truth in a way that can resonate, that can be transformative, and that most importantly of all, invites God to work. The healing and love is of God. We are just bearers of the good news of its existence. And so finally, we leave that outcome to God. When we encounter grief, when we encounter difficult circumstances and pain, things that scare us in ourselves and in others, all we can do at the end of the day is hold space for God to work, to ask God to work in us, offer the best of what we have in service of that work of God, but ultimately the outcome is God's. And the difficult thing is that sometimes it won't be the right time for it yet. Sometimes we'll mess it up or make mistakes. Sometimes whoever it is that we're encountering won't be ready for that yet. They get to say no too. But I think God so often takes that effort, even that trying, even that moment when you have to shake the dust off your feet and walk away. God uses that and works in us and through us and among us anyway, in ways that we can't even understand or imagine. So show up. Listen. Speak the truth. And don't take responsibility for the outcome. It's God's work, God's healing, God's love. We just enter in, hold the space, decide whether or not to open the door.